I will get started. Thanks for joining me. Happy Thursday. Oh my God. I wanted to chat about all these new US or AI regulations that are happening in the US or they're being passed in the US right now on the federal and the state level. On June 2nd, President Trump signed an executive order that created a voluntary process where the largest frontier AI companies, like the ones behind Claude and ChatGPT and Gemini, can give the federal government up to 30 days to evaluate a new model before releasing it. The models that this would apply to are the ones whose cyber capabilities cross a threshold the federal government sets through a classified benchmarking process. The Departments of War, Homeland Security, and Commerce run that process jointly. What they're testing for is whether a model can find and exploit software vulnerabilities at a scale that raises national security concerns. If it can, it qualifies for the 30-day pre-release review. During that window, the government assesses whether the model can discover and exploit software vulnerabilities at a scale that raises national security concerns. Participation is voluntary. The order specifically bars the government from turning this into a licensing or pre-clearance requirement, and the companies who opt out face no legal penalty. In practice, though, the federal government is a significant customer for these labs, so voluntary participation does carry some weight. Alongside this order, Trump issued a separate executive order establishing an AI litigation task force to challenge state AI laws the administration considers inconsistent with federal policy. Meanwhile, states are moving in their own directions. California passed the Transparency and Frontier Artificial Intelligence Act. Colorado repealed its original AI Act and replaced it with SB 189. Texas enacted the Responsible AI Governance Act, known as TRIGA, and New York passed the Responsible AI Safety and Education Act, called RAISE. If you're an operator, a technical builder, or a senior leader responsible for how AI is used in your company, you're looking at all of this and asking some pretty reasonable questions like, what does any of this have to do with me? I'm not a frontier lab. I don't train models. My team uses it to get their work done. The answer to that is that every rule these executive orders and state laws create at the model level trickles down into your company. So into your vendor list, into your procurement cycle, into what your legal team lets you deploy. And that's what I wanted to talk about this morning. By the end of the session, I want to get you to a place where you understand what these new AI regulations mean for enterprise AI projects. I'll also leave you with 3 practical steps your company can take this week to work within those regulations. If you don't already know me, I'm Hodman Murad. I'm the founder of Asaura AI. We build productivity tools for neurodivergent people. I'm also a creator on Substack where I publish 2 newsletters, the first being Between Thinking and Doing, where I design structured AI systems for high performers who are facing execution friction and want to get traction on their complex lives, and the Data Letter, where I teach senior managers, operators, and technical builders how to build with AI. All free subscribers of Between Thinking and Doing get a friction audit to help you determine what it is that's holding you back from getting your work done. And then all free subscribers of the Data Letter get an AI readiness checklist that will score just how far along your team is with AI adoption instead of just doing guesswork. Here are the links to subscribe to both. If you're watching this on YouTube or LinkedIn, it's linked in the post with the recording. So enterprise software has always been reviewed. Legal has always looked at the contract. Security has always vetted vendors. That process isn't new. What's new is what the review has to cover. Before AI regulation, a vendor review focused on contract terms, data residency, security certification, and integration risk. So standard work for any procurement team. That same review now has to evaluate training data provenance, algorithmic discrimination testing, model drift monitoring, automated decision-making disclosures, or ADMD, and catastrophic risk assessments. So these are categories of exposure that traditional enterprise procurement was never designed to handle. And every review function your company already runs still applies to AI. What each one has to evaluate is different now. So if your company is operating in the United States in any capacity, there are now four separate pieces of regulation that govern corporate AI adoption, and each one produces a different set of obligations for your company. The first is the June 2nd federal executive order I described earlier. It creates that voluntary 30-day pre-release window for frontier models the government designates as covered. For your company, this means the release schedule of the models you depend on is no longer entirely in your vendor's hands. If a new capability you're planning around gets held for review, your roadmap has to absorb. The order also introduces a trusted partner tier where a small group of companies receives early access ahead of a general release. So if a competitor of yours is a trusted partner and your company isn't, they'll ship features based on a newer model before you can. The second is state level frontier AI legislation led by California's Transparency and Frontier Artificial Intelligence Act and New York's RAISE Act. So these laws apply to the developers of the largest models. They require those companies to publish safety protocols, run testing for catastrophic risks like helping someone build or attack critical infrastructure, and tell the public whenever they makes a significant change to how the model was trained or how it behaves. Your vendor's compliance with these laws becomes part of your due diligence file because your risk and legal teams will ask for that documentation before they approve the purchasing and deployment with these tools. I think this is all great stuff, but it's new things that companies have to deal with in terms of procuring and using these AI tools. The third is state legislation on automated decision-making technology, including California's CCPA regulations. So these laws regulate the deployer, which is you. Whenever AI influences a consequential decision about a person, so if your teams use AI in hiring, credit approvals, insurance, housing, healthcare, or consumer-facing decisions, you fall within that scope. They require you to risk assessments, provide users with the ability to opt out, and in some cases, mandatory disclosure at the point of use. And then the fourth is federal procurement guidance from the White House Office of Management and Budget. So if your company sells to the federal government or to a partner that does, these memoranda have already changed your vendor contracts. So they require any AI vendor selling to the federal government to disclose when their AI is being used in sensitive settings, meaning settings where the AI's output could affect someone's civil rights, their access to essential services like healthcare or housing, their safety, or the security of critical infrastructure. So vendors also have to allow ongoing testing of the AI, give the government the ability to switch to a different vendor without losing their data or their work, and grant stronger rights over how that data is used than the industry standard. So each of these regulations applies to a different party. The federal order applies to companies building frontier models. State frontier laws also apply to them. State automated decision-making laws apply to your company whenever your teams use AI to make consequential decisions about people. And then federal procurement guidance changes the contracts you sign with those model developers and any AI vendors you buy from. But I'd say the operational effect on your company is still the same. Every one of them changes what your existing review functions have to evaluate. While much of this regulation does apply to frontier labs, your company will absorb a meaningful share of the compliance work anyway. And every enterprise AI project now passes through 4 review points that correspond to the regulations that we just covered. I'm going to call them the 4 adoption gates. So the first is vendor selection. So your risk team now expects a vendor to produce a published safety protocol, a recent third-party audit, an incident response process, and a training data disclosure that satisfies state regulation. Performance still matters, of course, but documentation is what gets the vendor in the room with you. It's what's most important at this point. So if the vendor can't produce these artifacts, they don't reach the evaluation stage, which is a change from 2 years ago when a demo and like a SOC 2 report were enough to open a conversation. The second gate is use case screening. So not every use case carries the same regulatory weight. Automating a sales email is different from automating a hiring screen. So the screening question is whether the use case influences a consequential decision about a person in employment, credit, insurance, housing, or healthcare. If it does, state regulations require your company to run an impact assessment, build in human review, and provide disclosure to affected consumers before you deploy. Screening your own use cases matters because when an auditor identifies one as a consequential decision, you have to produce every impact assessment and disclosure you should have been running from day one. So all of that paperwork is retroactive. The third gate is monitoring. I write about this so much on the data letter. Models drift and outputs that were fine at launch can become a legal liability 6 months from now. So employees use AI tools in ways your company never approved if you don't have certain guardrails. So your teams need documented logs of what the model was asked, what it produced, how its behavior has changed over time. And without those logs, your company can't detect a bad output before it becomes an incident. And then the fourth gate is documentation. So when an AI system produces a bad outcome, a discrimination claim, a data breach, a regulatory inquiry, your company's legal exposure comes down to what you can prove about the decisions you made. So risk assessments, change logs, incident response records, and training data disclosure, from your vendor turn a potentially unlimited liability into one that is bounded. So without that paper trail, every incident becomes an investigation, and your company has kind of like no way to demonstrate reasonable care. So those are four gates, all of them that are created by regulations that were written for someone else, and now you have to deal with them. There are three specific steps your company can take right now to prepare for these regulations and reduce the operational cost of every AI project going forward. The first step is to build a use case intake from before, or sorry, the first step is to build a use case intake form before you build any pilot. So that form is a document you fill out before any AI project gets a green light. It needs to capture what the project aims to do, what data it will use, and whether it will influence a consequential decision about a person. This form satisfies the use case screening gate at the earliest and cheapest point in the project. Companies that don't have one tend to discover the regulatory exposure in the middle of a build when the cost of stopping and redesigning the project is at its highest. The second step is to ask vendors for evidence instead of assurances. So you'll want a vendor who hands you a published safety protocol, a recent third-party audit, a written disclosure of what data the model was trained on, and a documented incident response process your legal team can review. The third step is to reduce your company's dependency on any single AI vendor's release schedule. So swapping between closed weight providers gives your team flexibility on pricing and performance. Every one of those vendors is covered by the same US regulation. So if the federal government holds a new model for review, all of them are affected at once. And switching between them doesn't really insulate your product from that risk. Open weight models your team hosts directly are the strongest tool for solving that problem, because a model already on your servers isn't waiting on a federal review window. Although they aren't right for every use case, frontier closed weight models still lead on the hardest reasoning tasks, and running open weight models at enterprise scale does carry real operational cost. And no matter which model you use, your company still owns every deployer obligation under state law. So the practical version of this step is to look at your roadmap, identify the features where a delay at a frontier lab would hurt your competitive position, and evaluate open weight model. Excuse me, and evaluate open weight models specifically for those. So there's a version of this session where I tell you the regulatory picture will settle down soon, that Congress will pass a federal AI law, that the states will fall in line, and everything will get predictable. But I don't think that's an environment your company is operating in anytime soon, especially knowing the US. So the current federal administration wants a light federal framework, and it's willing to challenge state AI laws in court to get there. The AI litigation task force I mentioned earlier is already fighting Colorado. In the meantime, California and New York keep passing more and more legislation, and Texas has decided to take a narrower angle. So your company is working from a rule book per state, per sector, per use case, and that's kind of like the environment for the foreseeable future. Which means the four adoption gates I just went through are the environment your teams will work inside. And the companies that lead over the next 2 years will be the ones that design workflows resilient enough to absorb new regulation without collapsing every time a new state law takes effect. Later this week, I will be publishing a piece on Substack that walks you through how to build these workflows on the data letter called Building an AI Adoption Intake System. And it'll hand you the workflow that puts all of this into practice, everything downstream of today's framework in one workflow ready to implement inside your company once this article is published. So if you're watching this on Substack right now, you can subscribe to the data letter. I shared the link to do that in the chat here. If you're watching this on YouTube or LinkedIn, the way to subscribe or the link directly to the article, depending on when you're watching this, is in the post description. Thank you so much for spending this time with me, and I'll see you guys next week. Bye.